Okay, we'll start. So last week I introduced the low temperature representation of the Gibbs measure. So let me just remind you basically of the notation. So we saw that if we look at the Gibbs measure in the box, square box Bn with plus boundary condition, then the probability of a configuration could be written as follows. So we had the product over all contours gamma in the configuration omega of E minus 2 beta times the length of the contour gamma divided by the sum over all configuration omega tilde in omega Bn plus, and the same thing, product of all contour in the configuration, in the contour of the configuration omega tilde E minus 2 beta times the length of gamma. Okay, so that was the low temperature representation, and then we want to use it now in order to prove that beta critical is finite. So so it's part B. So part A was deriving this representation. Part B is the core of the argument, which is a so-called Peierls argument. So remember, our goal is to prove that, what I explained last week, our goal is to prove that the probability under this measure that the spin in the center of the box Bn takes value -1, even though you have plus boundary condition, this probability is going to 0 as beta is going to infinity. Okay. That's what we want to show. Okay, so the observation is the following one. It's elementary, but it's very important. So we have the box Bn here with plus boundary conditions. And we are asking, for this event, we are asking the spin in the middle to take the value, okay, take the value -1. So we have a minus spin here. And then the only possibility for this to happen is that there is somewhere in this configuration, there is at least one contour surrounding the origin. Okay. Because you have to go from plus to minus. In order to go from plus to minus, you have to cross contours. Okay, so at least there must be at least one contour, let me call it gamma star, which surrounds the origin. There could be more than one. There could be, for example, any odd number would do. There could be, for example, these 3 contours plus other contours elsewhere, but certainly I must have at least one contour which surrounds the origin. So let me just write this a bit more precisely. So I want to define the interior of a contour. So let me draw some contour. So maybe this is a contour gamma, or contour gamma star, whatever. Remember that we introduced some way of deforming the contour at crossings, so that all the contours are just simple closed curves in the plane. And then, since a simple closed curve in the plane, it has a well-defined interior, which would be this set. Okay. This thing is the interior of gamma star. Okay. So what I want is that, so what I'm claiming is that sigma 0 equal -1, this, the probability that sigma 0 is equal to -1, it was Bn. It's always smaller than the probability that there exists some contour gamma star in the configuration, let's say, in the contour gamma of the configuration, such that 0 is in the interior of gamma star. Okay. So that's the basic observation, which allows us to relate this probability, which is expressed in terms of the spins, to a probability, an event which only depends on the contours of the configuration, so which is easily expressed in this way. Okay, so let's see what it gives us. So we have mu plus Bn. Let me rewrite this here, so it's exactly the same. So this is smaller than we said mu plus Bn there exists gamma star in gamma such that 0 is in the interior of gamma star. Okay. And then I can use the union bound, make very rough estimates. So this is smaller than the sum over all gamma star. Okay. All gamma star such that the interior of gamma star contains the origin. And then I want the probability that gamma star, yes, let me write it like that. That gamma star is one of the contours of the configuration. Okay, this I can certainly always do. Now we need to estimate this quantity, and there is a lemma for that. It's lemma 350. For any beta, for any contour gamma star, the probability that gamma star belongs to the contour of the configuration, this is always smaller than E minus 2 beta times the length of gamma star. Okay. So that's what I want to prove now, and from this it will be very easy to conclude that this is going to 0. Okay, so let's prove that. So to prove this, I want to use this representation, which is here. So let's just write things down explicitly. So we have mu plus Bn that gamma star is in gamma. By definition, by this representation, this I can write as follows. So it's the sum over all configuration omega. Okay. All configuration omega in omega Bn plus such that gamma star is a contour of the configuration omega. Then have the product over all contours in the configuration omega, E minus 2 beta gamma, divided by the sum over all omega tilde, or say omega, doesn't matter here. Product over gamma in gamma of omega, E minus 2 beta gamma. So I've just used this expression for the probability of the configuration, and I'm summing over all configurations which are compatible with this event. Okay. So now, one thing we can observe is that in this product here, there is one factor which is always present. It's E minus 2 beta gamma star, because gamma star is always a contour of this configuration. So I want to take out this factor which is always here. So this is equal to E minus 2 beta gamma star. And then I have the sum over all omega in the box Bn compatible with the plus boundary condition, such that, say, gamma star is a contour of the configuration. And then I have the product over all gamma in gamma of omega, but not gamma star, because I've already taken it out here, E minus 2 beta gamma. And here I divide by the sum over all omega in omega Bn plus product over the contours E minus 2 beta gamma. So what I want to do now is to prove that this ratio is smaller than 1, always smaller or equal 1, okay, which will give us the claim here. Okay. So that's not very difficult. What we'll do is that let's start with the configuration omega, like in the numerator here. So configuration in Bn with plus boundary condition, which contains the contour gamma star. Okay. Starting from this configuration omega, I want to construct a new configuration. Let me denote it by maybe like that. E gamma star of omega, so it will be again a configuration in Bn with plus boundary condition. It's constructed as follows. So I want it to satisfy, if I take this configuration and I look at the contours of these configurations, I want the set of contours of this configuration to be all the contours of omega except for gamma star. So I want to remove the contour gamma stars from the contours of omega. So this gives me gamma of omega minus gamma star. Okay, I want to take a configuration, like here I want to take a configuration of contours, and I want to remove the orange one, so gamma star, and I obtain a new configuration. So let me show that this is always possible. So explicitly what you have is that this configuration here, E gamma star of omega, it's really, you can construct it as follows. So at vertex I, it's given by omega I if I is not in the interior of gamma star, and it's given by minus omega I if I is in the interior of gamma star. Okay, it's very easy to check. Maybe I can make a picture to convince you that it's okay. So we have these plus boundary conditions, and then we have some contours. So that's the contour gamma star. Okay, the origin is here, and then I have some other contours. Let me just make a simple picture like that. And I want to remove gamma star. Okay, so here I have pluses because of the boundary condition. Now I have minuses here, then I have minuses here, plus here, and so on. Okay. Now what I want to do is, what I said is that if you want to remove the contour gamma star, what you do is you put pluses everywhere here where you had minuses, you put minuses where you had pluses. So the contour here remains because I'm going from plus to minus, so there's still a contour here. But this contour disappears because now I have pluses next to pluses, and this removes the contour gamma star. Okay, that's the construction I've sketched here. So here we are using, in an essential way, the symmetry using the plus-minus symmetry of the model, which is true when the magnetic field is 0, using the symmetry in an essential way. Okay. So this kind of argument really relies on the symmetry between plus and minuses. You can you can extend it to models where you don't have such a symmetry, but the proof becomes much, much harder. Okay, but here we have symmetry, so we can do this trick, and therefore I can always, starting from any configuration which has gamma star as a contour, I can always construct a new configuration which has the same contours except that I've removed gamma star. Okay, then that means that in this, of course it's a bijection. Okay, if I start with a configuration which has, if I start with this configuration, I can recover the configuration omega by just adding gamma star to this configuration. So I have a bijection between the two sets. So this sum here, I can replace it by a sum over, or the sum which is here, I can replace it by a sum over all configurations which are of this form. So let me give them a name. So let's write maybe like that. This will be the set of all configurations in omega Bn plus, such that there exists omega tilde in omega Bn plus with omega is equal to what was my notation, E gamma star of omega tilde. Okay. All the configuration that I can obtain from another configuration by removing the contour gamma star. Okay, then that allows me to rewrite the probability we are interested in as follows. So the probability that sigma 0 is -1. This is equal, so I'm just continuing from here. So there is this E minus 2 beta, maybe I'll do it here, E minus 2 beta gamma star. Okay. And then I have this ratio of kind of partition functions. So in the top, what I can do is I can sum over all omega which belongs to this, to E gamma star, product over all contour gamma in this configuration omega, now I don't have to remove gamma star because gamma star is not there. I've already removed it in the definition of this set. Okay, E minus 2 beta gamma divided by the sum over all omega in omega bn plus product over all gamma in gamma of omega E minus 2 beta gamma. And then you just compare the numerator and denominator, and what you see is that they are identical, except that here I'm summing over a subset of this guy, because this is a subset, it's a set of configuration in omega bn plus, which satisfies some additional constraints. So this is a smaller number than there, so all this is smaller than 1. Okay. So this means that you get as an upper bound E minus 2 beta gamma star, which is what we wanted. Okay. So we have this lemma, and now using this lemma here, it's very simple to conclude. So let me explain this. Is there a question? It's okay. So let's see. So I take again this expression. So we have the probability that sigma 0 is minus 1. We have just seen that this is smaller than the sum over all contours gamma star which surround the origin. So that interval gamma star contains the origin of E minus 2 beta times the length of the contour. Okay. So it's convenient to replace this, to do this sum in two steps. I will first sum over the length of the contours and then over all contours which have a given length. So this I can write as the sum over all lengths, larger or equal to 4, because the smallest contour you can have which surround the origin has length 4. It's a small square. Okay. And then I have, this is only depending on the length of the contour, so I have E minus 2 beta L. And then what remains is just the number of contour gamma star such that the length of gamma star is L and the interior of gamma star contains the origin. Okay. Now I claim that this thing, so claim, this number of contours which have length L and surround the origin, it's smaller than, say, L over 2 times 4 to the n. Okay. Let's assume it's true. I will prove the claim in a few seconds. So let's assume that this is true. So what you get is that this is smaller than sum over L larger or equal to 4, L over 2, 4 E minus 2 beta to the power L. So as soon as beta is large enough, this is a convergent series. And not only that, if I let beta go to infinity, this is a series which goes to 0. So this I can define as this delta of beta, which we introduced last week. And clearly, delta of beta is going to 0 as beta is going to infinity. Okay. So the only thing I still have to justify is this rough upper bound on the number of contours surrounding the origin and of length L. So proof of the claim. And it's almost immediate. So let's start with a picture. So we have the origin somewhere. And then let me draw this. So that's a line of length L over 2. And these are the edges which cross this line. Okay. Now I claim that the contour gamma star, any contour gamma star of length L which surrounds the origin, has to contain one of these edges. If it's not the case, that means that the contour would be doing something like that. If it's not, it has to surround the origin. If it's not using these edges, then it has to go further away. But that means that the total length of the contour has to be larger than L over 2 plus L over 2 plus something. It will be larger than L. The length of gamma would be larger than L, which is not possible. I want contour of length L. So the length cannot be larger than L. So necessarily the contour has to use at least one of these edges, maybe several, but at least one. So it has to do something like that. Okay. So now if I want to compute how many to bound the number of these guys, what I can do is the following very rough estimate. I choose the starting edge. To choose the starting edge, I have at most L over 2 choices. So that's choice of starting edge. And then when I want to continue, say, suppose I've taken this one, then for the next step, I have to choose among the neighbors. I have 4 neighbors. At most, I have 4 choices for the next step, and then 4 choices for the next step, and for each step, I have 4 choices. So then I have at most 4 to the L. That's each step. At each step, one has at most 4 choices. Actually, we could even take 3, but the bound that we get doesn't matter very much. As long as it's exponentially increasing in L, we can kill it with the E minus 2 beta, which is here. So that gives us an upper bound on the number that we were looking for. Okay, so that explains the claim. This just comes from this very rough estimate. Okay? So this proves that beta C, everything we've done here, prove that, say, sigma 0 plus beta 0 is strictly positive for all beta large. Okay, which implies that in dimension 2, which implies that beta C of 2 is finite. Okay. So now I would like to explain to you how we treat the higher dimensions, dimension 3 and more. So there are 2 ways you can do that. There are more than 2 ways, but there are certainly at least 2 ways. One is to take the proof we have just made and check that everything works also in higher dimensions. All this construction with the contours and so on is exactly the same thing. The only place where you have to work a bit harder, it's not even much harder, but a bit harder, is in the estimate of the number of contours surrounding the origin with a given size. Problem being that now you have random surfaces. You don't have just lines, you have really surfaces, hypersurfaces in dimension D, and summing of, controlling the number of these guys is a bit harder than controlling the number of lines, but you can try to do it as an exercise if you want. What I will do instead is to show that this quantity beta C of D, it's decreasing with D. So if we have proved that it's finite when D is equal to 2, it's also finite when D is larger than 2 because it's decreasing with D. That's what I would like to explain. So what's the name of this? C extension to dimension 3 and more. Okay. I will explain how you go from dimension 1 to dimension 2 because it's easy to draw 1 and 2 dimensional objects on the blackboard, but the proof does not depend. You can go from any dimension to dimension plus 1. Okay. So let me just explain, make a picture in the case of 1 and 2 dimension. So I have here a piece of I have the box Bn, dimension 2, something like that. okay, say with the origin somewhere. Let's say the origin is here. Then we have plus boundary conditions. And so on, so forth. And what I want to do now is the following. So that's supposed to be picture of Bn in dimension, say, d, but d is equal to 2 on the blackboard. Okay? And then I have here, this set here. This is Bn in dimension d minus 1. Here 1, because I'm on the blackboard. Okay? But this, if I just take this, imagine this in dimension 3, I'm just looking at this square of radius n, so it's really the square in dimension 2. Okay. So you really have, you can see the d minus 1 dimensional Bn as a subset of the d dimensional Bn. And now what you do is the following thing, it's not very difficult. You change the value of the coupling constants. Not all of them. I mean, all these coupling constants, by construction, they are all equal to beta. I mean, the interaction between this spin and this spin is beta, the interaction between this spin and this spin is beta, and so on and so forth. But for those which I will draw now in green, I will change the interaction to beta times s, some number s. So I will do that, so that's not very useful. Maybe in blue. I will do that for all the edges, all the interactions that connect this d minus 1 dimensional version of Bn to the rest of the box Bn in dimension d. So all these edges which are orthogonal to this plane here, incident on the plane. Okay, I hope you can see something. So for all these edges which I've drawn in blue, I take a coupling constant which is given by beta times s. Think of s being between 0 and 1. Okay. Now, when s is equal to 1, so let's look at mu plus Bn. Okay, let me write it differently. Let me write it like that. Let's look at sigma 0 plus Bn. Let's say to say in which dimension I am, let me put a small d here and a d minus 1 here to stress the fact that I'm looking here at the box Bn in dimension d and here at the box Bn in dimension d minus 1. So I'm looking at it in dimension d for the moment. Then the coupling constants are given by beta and s, and then the magnetic field H is equal to 0 as usual in this part. Okay. So this completely characterizes the measure. So I'm looking, so when I write that, I'm really saying that I'm taking beta everywhere except along these blue edges where I'm taking beta s. Okay. So I want to look at this quantity. Now, first observation is that this is equal, when s is equal to 1, this is just sigma 0 plus BND beta 0. H equals 0. Okay. Because, okay, if I take S equal to 1, I have beta everywhere. I'm just computing this expectation. Now, what happens when S is equal to 0? When S is equal to 0, what I'm really doing is that I'm removing all these edges. It's the same thing. Okay, the coupling is equal to 0, so all the terms in the Hamiltonian, they disappear. So I'm removing all these edges, and by doing so, I'm completely disconnecting this d minus 1 dimensional version of Bn from the rest of the system. Okay? So what I get is the expectation of sigma 0 plus in bd minus 1 n beta h equals 0. Okay? But now we know from the Griffiths inequality, the GKS inequalities, that the expectation of products of spins, it's increasing in the coupling constants. So now I have a coupling constant which takes value 1, on all the blue edges. Here it takes value 0 on all the blue edges, so it's smaller here than it's here. So this quantity is larger than this one by GKS. Okay? So as soon as there is a spontaneous magnetization, as soon as this quantity is strictly positive in dimension d minus 1, it's also strictly positive in dimension d. Okay? And what we have proven is that this is strictly positive in dimension 2 when beta is large, which means that it's also strictly positive in dimension 3, and then 4, 5, 6. Okay. Okay. So this proves that what we did in dimension 2 implies the result in any dimension larger than 2. So is the argument clear, or are there questions? It's a very important argument, so you have to understand that. So if something is not clear, you should ask questions. Okay, if not, yes?
Does the number of surfaces surrounding 0 grows exponentially as well?
Yes. Yes. Actually, the lemma which you would need to get an upper bound will be worse than this one, but to get a similar type of upper bound, I will introduce it soon because we will need it to prove that there is a unique Gibbs measure at high temperature. We'll need the same type of lemma. So you will see how to do that. But yes, it will grow exponentially with the area, say, of the contour. Okay. So let's move to, so now, again, remember we are interested in this phase diagram. So we have H and beta, and then somewhere there is beta C. We want to show that it's non-trivial, and we want to show that for beta larger than beta C, there are multiple Gibbs states, and everywhere else there is uniqueness. Okay. Everywhere else there is uniqueness. So we have already proved that for beta large, there are multiple, and H equals 0, there are multiple Gibbs states. That's what we have just done now. So what I want to do now is to prove that for beta small and H equals 0, there is a unique Gibbs state. Okay, so that's section 373, uniqueness at high temperature. Uniqueness at high temperatures. So there are many ways of proving uniqueness at high temperatures. I'm using one which is somehow specific to the Ising model, even though it's not so specific. But it's pretty easy. So that's an advantage. But there are much more general ways of proving that. So our goal here, okay, it's to prove uniqueness at high temperature. And we have seen that one way of doing that, so our goal is to prove that beta, say beta C of D is positive in any dimension. It's always strictly positive. So that means that really beta C is not at 0, not at infinity. It's sitting somewhere on the relaxes, positive relaxes. And actually, we'll also deduce from this the fact that in dimension 1, it's in fact equal to plus infinity. Okay? What we did before was not true. I mean, all this Spiers argument that I have explained is not, I have always assumed that dimension is at least 2. Okay? That actually it's a good exercise for you to check what is, where in the proof something is going bad in dimension 1. It must fail in dimension 1 because we are going to prove that beta C of 1 is plus infinity. This Spiers argument must fail in dimension 1. Check where the argument collapses. It's a good exercise. It's not very difficult, but you really have to understand what's going on. Okay, so that our goal is to prove that. This will come for free from our analysis here. And in order to do that, what we'll do is that we'll check that sigma 0 plus beta H equals 0, okay, that this is 0 for all beta small enough, all beta small enough. Okay. we have seen that this is enough to prove that beta C of D is positive. Okay, so let's do that. This relies also on another representation of the measure, or actually of the correlation functions, which is called the high temperature representation. Okay, high temperature. Now, the first step in this representation is to observe that sigma I, sigma j, this product which appears in the Hamiltonian, this is always equal to plus or minus 1 for all ij. Okay. So this allows me to rewrite the factor E beta sigma I, sigma j in a different way, which will be convenient. So this I claim I can always write as cosh beta plus sigma I, sigma j sinh beta. So why is this true? I mean, it's kind of obvious, but let me show that it's really nothing special. So the cosh, I can write it like that. The sinh, I can write it like that. Now, if sigma I, sigma j is equal to plus 1, so on the left-hand side I have e to the beta, then what do I have on the right-hand side? Well, I have e to the beta plus e minus beta over 2 plus e beta minus e minus beta over 2. So the e minus beta disappears. I get twice e to the power beta over 2, so I just get e to the beta. I'm happy. Now, if sigma I, sigma j is equal to minus 1, I get the same as before, except that now, because this is equal to minus 1, the e to the power beta disappears, and what remains is e minus beta minus e minus beta, so I get e minus beta. Okay? So this is just an identity, and it's slightly easier if I take out the cosh. So let me factor the cosh, so cosh beta times 1 plus sigma I, sigma j hyperbolic tangent of beta. Okay. So of course the same thing, but it will be more convenient in this way. Okay, so that's for one factor e to beta sigma I, sigma j, but now I can write the Boltzmann weight as a product over these such factors. Let's see what it gives us. Okay, so now I would like to understand how the product over all ij in the edges of the graph. Have I taken an arbitrary box such as Bn? I don't remember. Where have I put this? I do it for an arbitrary box, so let's do it for an arbitrary box. So product over all edges in this box of E beta sigma I, sigma j. Now for each of these E beta sigma I, sigma j, I'm using the identity which is there. So this is equal to cosh beta to the power of the number of edges, okay, times the product over ij in the edges of the graph, 1 plus sigma I, sigma j hyperbolic tangent of beta, just substituted. And then, of course, what we want to do is to expand this product. So what we get, let me do it like that. So cosh beta. And then we get, so when I expand the product for each edge in this set of edges, either I take the factor, I take a 1 or I take a sigma I, sigma j hyperbolic tangent of beta. I have to say for each edge if I'm taking this or that when expanding the product. So the set of edges for which I will take this term, I will call it E, capital E. So I get a sum overall capital E inside a subset of this set of edges. So these are all the edges for which I've taken this term. Okay? And then I get, because I've taken this term, hyperbolic tangent of beta to the cardinality of the set E. And then I get the product over all ij in E of sigma I, sigma j. Okay? Very good. So now, that's for the expansion of this Boltzmann weight. From this, I can now easily get an expression for the partition function. So if I take the partition function in lambda, beta 0 plus, okay, this is given by just the sum over configuration of factors of this type, ij, e lambda b, e beta, omega I, omega j. Okay, then I can just substitute for this, I substitute this expression. What I get is this cosh, beta, e lambda b. Then these are all finite sums, so I can do whatever I want. I will take first the sum over e. Okay, this depends on e, so let me take it out. And then this depends on the spin, so I will now introduce the other sum. I have the sum over all omega in omega lambda plus, and then product over all ij in E omega I omega j. Okay? I've just used the identity we derived earlier. I get this. And now what I have to do is to compute this sum. It's very easy. So let's do that. I will just look at this sum. So I have the sum over all omega of product over ij in E omega I omega j. This I can write as the sum over all omega of the product over I in lambda of omega I to some power which depends on I and E. Okay, and what is this power? Maybe I'll do it a bit below. Let me do it here, where I of I E. So how many times do I get a factor omega I? I get a factor omega I for each edges of E which has I as an endpoint. Each time I have an edge in E which has I as an endpoint, I get an omega I. Okay, so this will be equal exactly to the number, of j in ZD such that ij belongs to E. Okay, and that's the number. Number of edges which have I as an endpoint, and the edges of E which have I as an endpoint. So if I do that, now, what is the interest is that I'm summing over configuration omega, but the quantity I'm summing is completely factorized over the spins. Okay, it's a product. So I can factorize the whole sum. So this is equal to the product over I in lambda. Sum omega I is equal to plus or minus 1. Omega I to the power I of I. Okay. And now what is this quantity? Well, it depends. Let me change color. There are two possibilities. This quantity here is equal to, well, assume that I of IE is even, so if this is an even number, this is plus or minus 1, so plus or minus 1 to an even number, it's always equal to 1, so this is always 1. And then I'm summing over the two possibilities, so I get 2. So that's equal to 2 if IE is even. And if it's odd, then 1 to another number is 1, minus 1 to another number is minus 1. So I get 1 plus minus 1, I get 0. 0 otherwise. Okay? So this product here is non-zero if and only if IE is even for all I in the box. Okay? So what I get is the following. So let me go back to the whole expression. So I get that z plus lambda beta 0 is really equal to, okay, there is this prefactor, cosh beta, E lambda b. And then we get the sum overall. Let me just need a bit of room. So as I've just said, so the contribution is 0 if at least one of these IE is odd. So I can put the constraint that IE is even for all I in lambda. Okay? Otherwise, at least one of the factor in the product is 0, and then everything is 0. Okay? So this is certainly something you can do. And when this is true, when IE is even for all I in lambda, that means that I get a 2 for all I in lambda, so I get a factor 2 to the power lambda. Okay? And then what remains is just this hyperbolic tangent of beta to power. Okay? So that's the high temperature representation of the partition function. And that's not exactly what we want. We want a high temperature representation of a quantity of this type, the expected value of the spin at the origin, but we'll do that after the break. So we start again in 15 minutes. Okay, I think everybody is back. So let's resume. So this sum here, I don't want to write this condition 10,000 times, so let me just give a name to this object, this family of subsets. So I will write E, that's a really bad joke, E lambda even. This will be the set of all E lambda b, such that at each vertex of lambda n, the number of incident edges is even, all I in lambda. Okay, so this condition here is just that E belongs to this set. Okay, this to shorten a bit the notation afterwards. Okay, so that was for the partition function. And as I said, the quantity we are interested in is the expected value of the spin at the origin. So let me do the same thing for sigma 0 plus, I will not do the details, I will just explain what changes. So this is just, okay, by definition, it's sum over all omega in omega lambda plus omega 0 E, okay, let me write it as we wrote it just before, ij E beta omega I omega j. Okay, over the partition function. Okay. So the partition function, we know how to write it in this way, so good. And I want to write the numerator here in a similar way. So that's very easy to do because you just have to keep track of this omega 0, which is the only thing changing. Everything else is exactly the same. So if I do that, and we return to the beginning here, so here I have an additional omega 0. Okay? Okay, that's if I want to compute, say, sigma 0 plus lambda. And the only thing that, okay, so it's here also. So the only thing that changes is when I compute the number of time I get the factor omega I, this will not change when I is different from 0, but when I is equal to 0, I have an additional power which comes from this guy. So I get plus delta I0. Okay, if I is equal to 0, I get 1, an additional factor. So plus delta I0. Okay, and then what we get, let me do it in this color. Then what I get is, in this case, I get 2 if I is not 0 and E is even, but I get also 2 if I is equal to 0 and E is odd, because what I want is that IE plus 1 must be even, so I0E is odd, okay? And 0 otherwise. So that the only thing that changes is that the condition that the number of edges incident to vertices in lambda is even everywhere is replaced by the fact that it's even everywhere except at the origin where it has to be odd. Okay, that's the only change. The rest is the same, and what I get in this way is the following. So this will be the sum. So this prefactor here is the same in both cases, so they just cancel in the numerator and the denominator. What remains is the sum over all E in what I will call, so I wrote it like that, so lambda 0, so where E lambda 0, it's exactly the same kind of thing as here, except that I want IE to be odd at 0 in E lambda B, such that E even for all I in lambda minus 0, I0 E is odd. Okay. Then I get this, and the hyperbolic tangent of beta to the power to cardinality of E, and the denominator is just the partial function without this constant because they cancel. I just get sum over E in E lambda even hyperbolic tangent beta or E. Yeah, that's our representation of the expected value of the spin at the origin. It takes this very simple form in the high temperature representation. Okay. Problem is that it's not so easy to compare the numerator and the denominator because the kind of constraint I put on the set of edges E is different. So there is one simple way of removing this problem. It's the following one. So let E be like in the numerator, lambda 0, okay? And we will write E as the disjoint union of two sets. Write E as E is equal to E naught union E prime, where, so maybe a picture, but it's pretty obvious what I want to do, I think. So lambda is here, then we have 0 somewhere. And then let me draw this set E. So this set E, so maybe something which looks like that, except that I want it to be odd somewhere. So let me do it. Okay. For the moment, let me cheat, and then I will explain why I've cheated in a minute. Otherwise, I'm mixing several things. So that's our set of edges E. Okay. Okay, but still let me do it correctly. So if I want to do it correctly, let me do it like that. Okay, if I do it like that, this is a set E which has IE even everywhere. Actually, I could also have something like that. This would be possible. So for each vertex inside the box, the number of incident edges is even. Here I have 2, here I have 0, here I have 4, but everywhere it's even, except at the origin where I have an odd number. For vertices outside the box lambda, it can be even or odd, I don't care. Okay? There is no constraint outside lambda. All the constraints are inside lambda. Okay, so I get a picture of this type. And then what I do is that the connected component which contains 0, I call it E0. So this is E0, and the rest, E minus E0, this fourth thing here, it's E prime. Okay, it's clear. So E0 is connected. It's an element of E lambda 0. It's even everywhere except at the origin where it's odd. Okay, and it's connected. E prime is in E lambda even, and E and E0 and E prime share no vertices. They don't share any vertices. Okay? Like in the picture. Okay? So all this and this is E prime. This is E prime. Okay? So if I do this decomposition, I can rewrite the numerator as a sum over E0, which is in this set, and it's connected, and the sum over E prime, which is disjoint from E0, and which is in this set. And this will be convenient because it will look much more like the denominator. So let me maybe do it here. Okay, so I get that sigma 0 plus lambda beta 0, I will not repeat it every time. So this is sum over E naught, which belongs to this E lambda 0 and is connected. Okay. Then I get hyperbolic tangent of beta E naught. And then I get a ratio, which is the sum, okay, times, let me write it here, I have a bit more space, sum over all, let me write it E prime, okay. E prime in E lambda even, E prime disjoint from E naught in the sense that they don't share any edge, any vertex, okay. Hyperbolic tangent of beta to the power of E prime. And the denominator is a sum over all E in E lambda even hyperbolic tangent of beta to the power. And now it's immediate if you compare the numerator and the denominator that the numerator and denominator are identical except that you have an additional constraint here. Okay, it's all the E prime in this set, here it's the same as the set here, except that this one has to be disjoint from E0, so the numerator is smaller than the denominator, so this thing, exactly as before, it's smaller than 1. Okay, so I get that sigma 0 plus lambda beta 0, it's always smaller than the sum over all E0 in E lambda 0 connected, hyperbolic tangent beta to the cardinality of E0. Okay. Since I want to show that this, in the thermodynamic limit, when lambda goes to ZD, this goes to 0, it's a pretty useful expression because when beta is very small, hyperbolic tangent of beta is very small. So if something very small to the size of E0, this will have tendency to make E0 very small. We have to check that it's enough to conclude that the sum goes to 0. Let's see. Okay, so probably it's a new section. Let me check if I change the name. Yes, B. Exponential decay of sigma 0 plus, and now I only work with Bn, it's enough for what I want to do at small beta. So exponential decay of as a function of n at small beta. That's what we are going to prove. Now, if we go back to this picture I drew before, and we look at the set E naught that I have drawn here, we see that the set E naught I've drawn started from, okay, it contains 0 because it has to contain 0, but because it has to contain 0 because the number of edges of E naught which are incident at 0 is odd, so it's at least equal to 1. Okay. But it also contains some vertex which comes from outside the box. Okay. It went from 0 to some point outside the box. This is not just an accident, it's a necessity. Automatically it has to contain a vertex outside the box. That's what I want to explain now. So let E naught be a set of the type we're interested in, set of edges of the type we're interested in. Okay. And consider the following quantity. Sum over all I in ZD of I, E naught. So I'm computing, I'm computing the number of edges of E naught which have I as an endpoint. Okay? And summing over all I. So what can I say about this number? It's very easy to compute. What is this number? It's equal to what? I'm summing, so I have a set of edges, connected set of edges. The fact that it's connected plays no role for this part of the argument. I'm summing over all vertices of the graph, also those here, but those here they just get 0, so it does not matter. All these guys, I'm summing over all these guys. So this, I get a 1, I get a 3, I get a 3, I get a 2, a 2, 2, and so on and so forth. That's the sum I'm computing. Well, it's very easy to check that each edge, this edge, for example, it gives you one contribution to the incidence number at this vertex and one contribution at this vertex. Okay? So each edge gives you a contribution of 2 to this sum. So this must be equal to 2 times the number of edges in E0. Okay? Check it if it's not obvious. If you absolutely need a proof, just do it by induction, for example. But it's really an obvious fact. So this is 2 times the number of edges in E0. In particular, it's an even number. In particular, it is even. Okay? So now what do I know? I know that E0, that the origin, that 0, has an odd number of vertices, an odd number of edges incident. There is an odd number of edges from this set which are incident at 0, which means that, so this we know that it's even for all I in lambda minus 0, it's odd at 0, okay? That's what we know about this function. So now, if I'm summing even numbers, I get an even number, that's fine, but there is one odd number there, okay? So if E0 was entirely contained inside the box lambda, I would have an odd number plus a collection of even numbers. The sum could not be even. It's impossible. The only way that the sum can be even is if I get another odd number from another vertex. But the only vertices where I can get an odd number, apart from 0, are outside the box lambda. Okay, so this implies that there exists J not in lambda, or Bn, okay, not in Bn, such that J belongs to E naught. Or say I, let's be precise, is 0. Okay, they're actually odd. Okay, so the picture is exactly as I've drawn here. So why is this interesting? This immediately tells you that the cardinality of E naught has to be at least equal to n. Because it has to connect 0, which is in the middle of the box, to the outside of the box. The box is a square of radius n. So the shortest path which go from 0 to the outside of the box has length n, okay, or n plus 1. So certainly it has to have at least length n, at least n edges. This thing. Okay, that's very good because this is very small, and I sum only over terms which have a size which diverges with. Let me put Bn, which diverges with n. Okay, so let's see that it indeed gives us exactly what we want. Okay, so we conclude that sigma 0 plus Bn beta 0, this is smaller. Then I will again sum over the cardinality. Let me still call it L as before, but now L is at least equal to n. Okay. Then I get hyperbolic tangent of beta to the power L, and then I get the number of E naught in this set connected such that the cardinality of E naught is L. Okay. And again, I make a claim, which I will justify afterwards. So this number here, this is the claim. This number is smaller than 4d squared to the power n. Okay. Accept it for a while. I will prove it in a second. So this implies that this quantity is smaller than the sum L larger or equal to n of 4d squared hyperbolic tangent of beta to the power L. But this is smaller, say, than 4d squared beta, because hyperbolic tangent of beta is smaller than beta. Okay. 4d squared beta to the power L. So this is actually going to 0 as n goes to infinity for all beta which are smaller than 1 over 4d squared. Okay. This, if beta is smaller than 1 over 4d squared, what is between the brackets here, the parentheses here, it's smaller than 1, so this decays exponentially fast with n, actually. Okay. This will be smaller than E minus Cn for some C positive as long as beta is smaller than 1 over 4d squared. Okay, so this is going to 0. So this implies that sigma 0 plus beta 0 is 0 for all beta smaller than 1 over 4d squared. Which is what we wanted. So the only thing I still have to prove is the fact that indeed this number of connected graphs which have, okay, actually this will not matter. The number of connected graphs with L edges is at most 4d squared to the power L. That's what I want to prove. So proof of the claim, there is a lemma. 354. So proof of the claim. So it relies on following lemma. 54. Let G be a connected graph with okay, doesn't matter. A connected graph. Okay. Then there exists a closed path in G. So on the vertices of G, which moves across the edges of G. Okay. There exists a closed path in G visiting each edge of G exactly twice. Let me prove this. It's a one-line proof, essentially, by induction. Okay. If E has one edge, it's not very difficult, so induction. So assume that E, okay, G is VE, okay, and assume that you have only one edge, so the graph is this one, and the path in this closed path is just the one going here and going back. Okay, that's a closed path visiting exactly each edge twice. Okay. So now let's assume it's okay for all graphs with at most n edges. And let's consider a graph with n plus 1 edges. Then what I can always do, I take this graph, which has n plus 1 edges, and it's always possible to find one edge of this graph, at least one edge of this graph, which I can remove. And after having removed this edge, the remaining edges of the graph are still connected. Why? Well, either the graph is a tree, in which case you take any edge which leads to a leaf of the tree, you remove it, you still have a tree, okay, no problem. Or it has a cycle. If it's not a tree, it has a cycle somewhere, and you remove any edge along the cycle, and it's still a connected set of edges. Okay, so it's always possible to, so there exists E in E, such that E minus this edge is still connected. Okay. I'm looking at the graph G prime, which has this set of edges. Or it's possible that this was E, okay, and this was, so all of this is E. Okay. It's possible that if I remove this guy, the set of edges is still connected, but I have an isolated vertex. It can happen. Then you also remove this vertex and just keep this. This thing is a graph G prime. Okay, so I get G prime, which has with edges E minus small p. Then what you do is very easy. Let me explain it. Here I don't need much room, so let I be a common vertex of E and E prime. I know that this edge E, which is here, it comes from a connected graph G. So it has to be connected to the other edges. Okay? So there must be a point here I, which is both in G prime and in this edge E. So I take this. It's possible that there are two. It's possible that both endpoints of E are in E prime, but at least one you have. So let's take this guy. Then from this guy, I know that I have E here, and then I have E prime. Okay? And G prime if you want. G prime. Then what you do is you start at E, at I, you cross E twice, you're again back at I, and then you just take the closed path which exists by induction from I to I. Here there is a closed path visiting each edge exactly twice, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Take the one, this one exists by induction. Because now this graph G prime has at most n edges. Okay, it has actually exactly n edges. Okay. And this proves the claim. Okay. It's really a completely empty claim, but it's very useful for us because it allows you to compute the number of connected graphs of a given size, and to bound the number of connected graphs of a given size. And you do it as follows. So this implies, okay, maybe I take a larger piece of chalk. So this implies that the number of E say, in the edges of ZD, okay? I don't know how I wrote it, okay? Which is connected and contains L edges, and okay, and the origin. Okay. And 0 belongs to E. Okay. The number of such sets is very easy to bound because this is certainly smaller than the number of passes pi. It's a pass of length 2L starting at 0. Why? Because this lemma tells you that if you want to draw the connected graph G, one way to draw the connected graph G is just to draw these passes visiting each edge twice, exactly twice. Then what you see in the end is a picture of the graph. So one way to sum over all edges, all graphs which contain 0, which have L edges, is just to draw all possible passes, closed passes of length 2L visiting twice. Of length 12 visiting at least twice exactly twice every edge. Okay, and this is just an upper bound. I'm just looking at all the passes of length 2L, which start at 0, and I forget the fact that they have to be closed, that they have to visit exactly twice every edge. Just get a larger upper bound. And then this is what? Well, it has to start at 0. So the first point is fixed, it's 0. And then I have 2D neighbors. So I have to move to one of the 2D neighbors. When I've made my step, I have again 2D choices at most, and I go on like that. So I get 2D choices to the power 2L, which is the length of the path, and this gives you 4D squared to the power L. Okay? And that's the claim that was here. The number of connected sets containing 0 of cardinality L is bounded by 4D squared to the power L. Okay, so this proves all this. Prove what we wanted, which is that beta C of D is strictly positive for all D. Here we have not used the fact that dimension is bigger or equal to 2. It works in any dimension, including dimension 1. But actually in dimension 1 we can do much better. We just have to be a bit more clever at some point, but or less clever, actually. We just compute things explicitly instead of trying to bound them. Okay. So let me explain what happens in dimension 1. So I guess it's also give the name C. C, beta C of D equal 1 is equal to plus infinity. So that means that what we want to prove is that sigma 0 plus beta 0 is equal to 0 for all beta. That's the same. Okay. Let's go back to the expression we had. We had an identity for, okay, this guy in a finite box. So sigma 0 plus Bn beta 0. This was sum over all sets E in this E lambda 0 hyperbolic tangent of beta to the power E divided by sum over E in E lambda even hyperbolic tangent of beta to the power E. That's the original expression we found for the high temperature representation. Before we started being clever, we did it like that. And it's enough for dimension 1, so we just work with this. The point is that the number of graphs which contribute to this sum in dimension 1 is very small. Actually, you have exactly 2 graphs which contribute to this sum and 2 graphs which contribute to this sum. So just compute everything explicitly. So let's look at the numerator. So I want the graphs E which belongs to E, actually I can write it like that. So this set, I will write the graphs explicitly. So here is the box Bn. So we have 0, minus 1, 1, minus 2, 2, minus 3, 3, and so on, so forth. Okay, and then you have get minus n, n. Okay? And then you get the plus spin outside because it's plus boundary conditions. Okay? We are in dimension 1, so that's the picture. That's the box Bn. Okay? Let me draw it twice. I will just now put that, okay? And then pluses outside. I claim that there are only two, so let me draw the two graphs. So we want, in this set, we want the origin to have a single edge incoming at the origin. So the only possibility is that this edge is there or this edge is there. Okay? This is the only way to have I can have 0, 1, or 2 edges incoming at 0. I need an odd number, so it has to be 1. So it's either this one or this one. But if I've done that, let's say first here. Now this vertex is inside lambda n, so it must have an even number of edges incoming. So this means that this edge has to be here. But then the same is true for this guy. And you go on, you go on, you go on until you exit the box. Okay? And then you're done because this guy, there is no constraint, it's outside the box Bn. And then the same here, what you get is this. Okay? So these are the two graphs. This and this are the two graphs which belong to this set. Good. So let's see what it gives. So sigma 0 plus Bn beta 0, it's equal. So let's see. These two by symmetry, of course, they will give the same contribution. It will be 2 times hyperbolic tangent of beta to the power, and how many edges do I have? I have n plus 1 edges, so n plus 1. So that's for the numerator. Okay, very happy. Now we do the same for the denominator. What we get is that this set, even, is equal to, again, there are two graphs, so minus n, there is a plus, n, there is a plus, and a 0 in the middle, that's one, and the other one. Okay, so one possibility, now I want to have an even number of edges incoming at each vertex inside the box. One possibility is to have 0 edges incoming at all the vertices inside the box, so the empty graph. So that's one. Good, it's there. And the second one is to have 2 incoming edges at each vertex of the graph. There is no other possibilities. Okay? So this gives, okay, I was using this one. So what I get for the second one is this graph. So it's either empty or it's full. Okay? These are the two possibilities. So this gives me, in the denominator, so when it's empty, it gives me 1. And when it's full, it gives me hyperbolic tangent of beta to the power 2n plus 2, I guess. Okay. So you see that, so the denominator is always larger than 1. Okay. 1 plus beta is non-negative. Okay. 1 plus something, positive, so it's always larger than 1. And the numerator, hyperbolic tangent of beta is always smaller than 1. For any finite beta, it's smaller than 1. So I get a number smaller than 1 to the power n. This is going to 0 exponentially fast with n. For any beta, greater or equal 0. Okay, so that proves the claim in dimension 1, and this claim. So it's much easier in dimension 1. Actually, you already proved it in the, I believe, the first exercise sheets that you did, because you computed the pressure and you found an analytic function for the pressure at all temperature. It was always analytic. So in particular, the magnetization density has to be analytic, and it immediately follows from this also that you cannot have, like that beta c of d has to be equal, the beta c of 1 has to be equal to plus infinity. Okay. But that's a nice application of this high temperature representation, because it's, once you have it, it's completely elementary to prove the result. And actually, you get really an explicit expression for this expectation in finite boxes. Right? There is no approximation there. Okay, so this finishes everything I wanted to say, I think, yes, about the case h equal to 0. So for this phase diagram that I drew earlier, so h beta, now we know everything we want to know about the case h equals 0. So we know that there is a beta c, so in dimension 2 and higher, we know that there is a non-trivial beta c such that non-uniqueness is exactly here, and you have uniqueness there. So non-uniqueness of the Gibbs state, and here uniqueness. Okay. So what we want to study now is what happens when h is non-zero. So it's a section, I start here, 374, uniqueness in non-zero magnetic field. So our goal in this section is to prove that, so we saw many characterization, at least two characterization of uniqueness, non-uniqueness, and so on. I will use one here. What I will show is that the function h as to psi beta h. Okay. I will show that this one is differentiable. For all h non-zero. Okay? That's what we are going to do. But actually, we are going to prove much, much more than that. We are going to prove that, in fact, the proof will show that h goes to psi of beta h is analytic. I say real analytic. Analytic for all h non-zero. Of course, it's in particular differentiable, but it's much, much more regular than just differentiable. That's what we are going to prove. So if you want to prove that this function is real analytic, we have to, if you want to prove that, if you want to check analyticity properties of some functions, well, you have to consider them as functions of complex parameters, not real parameters. So now I have to start looking at this problem when h is not a real number, but it's a complex number. So physically, does not seem to make much sense, but we see that what happens for complex h has an impact on the physics of the system. This is something I will explain. And actually, it's not so true that it's completely physically realistic to consider complex h. There has been some recent proposal and experimental check how you can probe the value of the pressure for complex value of the magnetic field in the lab. It's pretty nice. So, but I won't explain this here, but if you want, I can give you references. So, okay, let me remind you, how much time do I have? 5 minutes. So let me at least say a few generalities, and then we'll prove this next week. So we have seen that the pressure psi could be obtained as the thermodynamic limit along any Ivanov sequence of finite volume pressures psi lambda whatever beta h for any sequence and for any boundary condition. Okay, this is something we proved long ago now. Okay. And now what I will do is that, okay, I know that this, at least when h is real, this does not depend on the boundary condition. So I can choose the boundary condition which is convenient for me, and when h becomes complex, it's not true that all boundary conditions are completely equivalent. So, except for the free boundary condition, all the other ones are much harder to study. Actually, I don't even know if we can prove convergence in general. Okay, so we'll consider psi lambda free. Okay. We take the limit with free boundary condition. In any case, we are only interested at what happens on the real axis. We'll use the complex values of h to prove real analyticity of this function, but we are really interested on what happens on the real axis, so I don't really care how to define this for complex h for arbitrary boundary condition and so on. Okay, this is not important for us. Then a few observations. First one is that, okay, that's kind of obvious. For any finite subset lambda in ZD, the partition function Z lambda free boundary condition, beta h, is really analytic. Okay, it's just a sum of exponential of plus or minus h, basically. Okay, so this finite sum of analytic functions, certainly a real analytic function. Okay, for that there is no problem. As long as lambda is finite, there is no problem. Okay. Second observation is that, okay, at least for finite lambda, I certainly have that the partition function is strictly positive for all h in R. Okay. Because again, it's a sum of exponentials. It's strictly positive. So combining the two things, I know that psi, the pressure, finite volume pressure, is real analytic for all h in R. And all finite subset lambda of ZD. Okay. But now something subtle has to happen, because I mean that's empty. Okay, it's just because you can write things completely explicitly. I mean, Z is analytic. It's not vanishing, so I can take the log. It's still analytic, and so this is a real analytic function. So that's empty for finite lambda. It's a really empty claim. But the point is that we know that the limiting function, this one, is not real analytic for all h in R. We know because we have just proved here that when h is equal to 0, all this line here is a line where the function psi is not even differentiable. Psi is not differentiable when I cross here. Not differentiable. Okay? So it cannot be analytic if it's not even differentiable. Okay? So something that must happen when we take the thermodynamic limit. Okay? Something subtle has to happen when lambda goes to infinity, because for any finite lambda things are fine, and but you can guess what can happen. I mean, real analytic means that you can find some neighborhood, in a sense, roughly, you can find some neighborhood of the real axis where in which you have, I mean, okay, for all h in R you can find a neighborhood of h where you can expand the finite volume pressure in series, in a convergent series. Okay, that's what it means to be real analytic. For all h, you can find such a small neighborhood. So if the limit is not analytic, that means that the radius of this, so it's not analytic at h equals 0. So it means that the radius of this domain in which I can expand, I mean the domain in which this function is analytic, has to go to 0 with lambda. When lambda goes to ZD, the radius of convergence of the series, the Taylor series of the finite volume pressure, has to go to 0. And that's what these kind of things are exactly what we will study next week. And we'll see that indeed it's related to the following mechanism. So this function, as I said, this function is non-zero on the real axis, but it's basically a polynomial. It's a polynomial in e minus 2h. We'll see if it's not obvious. Polynomial. The partition function is basically a polynomial in this variable. So of course it has to vanish elsewhere. So it's a polynomial it's a polynomial with a high degree, which is basically the number of vertices in lambda. So it has number of lambda zeros in the complex plane. So it has complex zeros. These things vanishes in the complex plane. And what will happen is that these complex zeros, okay, they come by pair, by symmetry, but okay. These complex zeros, they will accumulate at h equal to 0. Okay? You never have any complex zero on the real line, but they will accumulate. As lambda goes to infinity, you will have an accumulation of complex zeros at the origin. And you will have some complex zero which will get, at least one which will get closer and closer to the origin as lambda goes to ZD, and which will be responsible for the fact that the limiting function is not analytic at 0. Okay? But I will explain this in much more details next week. Okay. Are there questions about what we did today? No? Good. See you next week.